So the topic is the divergence, realist theory, realist foreign policy, and the gap between the two of them. And it's motivated by the war in Ukraine and the analysis that's become extremely prominent in the wake of that war, but has been sort of burbling along even before that, but just became even more salient, I would say. So Russia invades Ukraine in February of this year, and an analysis was people like John Mearsheimer, Steve Waltz to some extent, started making the analysis that this was in some way the West's fault, right? And this harked back to a famous article by John in 2014, arguing that the invasion of Crimea was the West's fault. And so the argument goes that NATO enlargement essentially was provocative and threatened Putin, and so left him no choice or little choice but to respond using force. And so in some broad sense, right, we started it, right? This was a NATO expansion in the United States. It's a form of Western aggression, and it's driven by liberal ideology, which is held to be hegemonic in the United States and governing American foreign policy, and also, especially in Steve's telling of the story, by self-seeking bureaucrats who are trying to ensure their own career goals and give themselves something to do. And this created a huge furor because these ideas seem quite consonant with some of Putin's justifications for the war, some Russian propaganda that was being put out, that this was NATO encircling Russia, NATO threatening Russia, this is a response to Western aggression. And so people were upset about that. But the point I want to make is not so much how close it is to Putin's propaganda, but how distant it is from the actual theory of international relations that has been propounded by these self-same people, that is very distant from realist theory. And so the bottom line up front, I had to put this slide in because I presented this first at Emory the week before APSA, and half my audience was leaving halfway through the talk to get on a plane to go to APSA. So if you have to leave after this slide, you basically got everything I'm going to say. So here it is. There's realist theory on the left, and there's realist foreign policy on the right. Realist theory, the motivations of states are hard to discern and basically symmetrical across states. We don't really concern ourselves that much with differing motivations amongst states. States compete for power. Domestic politics are secondary in terms of explaining international relations. Implications, the United States should compete for power vigorously with foreign states, ruthlessly try to weaken them, and maintain its hegemony. The orientation is hawkish, pro-use of force, pro-arms competition, et cetera. Realist foreign policy, other states are defensively security motivated, and so sort of benign in their motivations in a sense. The United States uniquely is aggressively motivated because of domestic political pathologies having to do with liberalism, having to do with the military-industrial complex, or domestic politics of one form or another. Implications, the United States should be more dovish than it is. It should be exercising restraint. The United States should come home and not be as aggressive around the world. So the overall orientation is dovish. And so I'm arguing that these two are fundamentally incompatible, inconsistent, and realist theory does not imply realist foreign policy. It is a social construction in the terms of in the paper. Okay, so roadmap for the talk here. We're going to talk a little bit about realist theory, a little bit about realism and NATO enlargement, and then cover three debates very briefly, one over Vietnam, over nuclear weapons, over grand strategy, and I could talk about the Iranian nuclear program if people are interested in that as well. I have a little brief section on that. Okay, so realist theory. And I take us back to the 1990s. Here's a picture of Ken Waltz. Of course, Ken Waltz's book was written in the late 1970s, 79. But I would argue it took about a decade for problems in that book to sort of come to light. So the Waltzian analysis is that anarchy is sort of like a syllogism. Anarchy causes the search for security because there's no one you can call, there's no 911. You have to fend for yourself. Anarchy leads to insecurity, search for security, and the search for security causes conflict. So it's pretty straightforward. If you want to be secure, you engage in conflict with other states. The intervention that I think, personally, because I was involved in it, I guess, is important is that security is actually a positive sum goal. It is not a negative sum goal. Everybody can be secure. Everybody in this room, for instance, is quite secure. Why? Because we're not killing each other. right? All you have to do to be secure is decide not to attack everybody else. If everyone decides not to attack everyone else is maximally secure. Their security is 1. If you think of security as your likelihood of surviving, everyone's likelihood of surviving is 1 so long as nobody attacks anyone. That applies in the international realm as well as it does in a seminar room, right? So security is a positive sum goal. It is unlike power. Power is a negative sum goal, but security is a positive sum goal. So if what anarchy causes you to want is security, that doesn't cause conflict because security can be attained by everyone simply by not attacking. So that's kind of a big hole in this Waltzian analysis, right? The search for security doesn't actually lead to conflict all by itself. You need something else. What is that something else? Well, 2 answers arose in the 90s to answer that question, to fill in that gap. And one is offensive realism, one is defensive realism. The offensive realists, like John Mearsheimer and a few others, say, the problem is, although it's true in theory that if we all just wanted security, we could be secure by attacking each other, we don't actually know that, right? We don't know other states' intentions, and therefore, we can't just sort of not attack and be dovish and hope that that's going to work out, right? There might be bad guys out there. We don't know people's motivations. Motivations aren't written on people's foreheads, and therefore, the level of uncertainty is so great that you have to just assume the worst and act in a competitive, power-maximizing fashion, right? That's offensive realism. That's the Mearsheimerian answer. The defensive realists aren't quite so pessimistic. These are people like Charlie Glaser, for instance, and basically argues that states are Bayesian updaters over motivations, right? You don't know necessarily what motivations are, but you have some idea, and you look for behavior, and you look for writings, and you look for other things to try to glean information about other states' intentions and motivations. And that is good enough in many cases. And you were able to sort of figure out friends from foes. In some cases, there's lingering uncertainty, and they should try to send costly signals. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But the bottom line is, for the defensive realists, you don't make the assumption that uncertainty is so insurmountable that we simply make worst-case assumptions. We actively try to figure out other states' motivations. And so we have friends and foes, right? We can distinguish between states that we trust and states that we don't trust. So those are 2 answers to that question. Right. So NATO enlargement, how does this sort of figure in with NATO enlargement, right? NATO enlargement, of course, NATO enlarged from 1949 all the way up to the present in various stages, as this little graph indicates, right? But the key debate is over what happened in the 90s, right? In the 1990s, of course, 89, Cold War comes to an end. 1991, Russia collapses. Russia is temporarily weakened by this shock to power, right? It becomes weaker than the Soviet Union ever was, for sure. But everybody knows it's going to regain some of its strength as time goes by, right? This is going to be a passing phase, right? There's going to be some rebound in Russian power. So what should the United States policy be to respond to that? All right, well, I would argue realist theory says we should compete vigorously. Certainly offensive realist theory says we should compete vigorously. Russia is going to try to rebuild the Russian Empire. They're going to try to reconquer the provinces that escaped them in 1991. They're going to possibly try to rebuild their dominance over Eastern Europe. That's going to be detrimental to the United States' security, and therefore we should oppose it. How should we oppose it? We should expand NATO, which we already have sitting on the shelf, to incorporate the former Soviet sphere. And therefore, once the Russians rebuild their strength and start knocking on the door again, they'll be confronted by a unified alliance. And so this temporary shock to their power will become, in fact, a permanent weakening in Russian power to the benefit of the United States. Right? But you don't get that sense if you read realist foreign policy commentary on the topic, which basically says we should have done nothing. We should have simply let it roll in hopes that we could preserve good relations with Russia, and if they want to rebuild their empire and rebuild their dominance over Eastern Europe, too bad, not a big deal. So there is a game theoretic model in the paper, and I won't go into it in great detail. But just to sort of hit the highlights, the reason I have the model is because I want to, so sort of one sort of sub-theme of the paper is that sort of the realist theory of the 80s, 90s, et cetera, is sort of pointing towards the game theoretic approach to international relations, right? All these arguments of here's my assumptions, such as in Mearsheimer's 2001 book, here's my deductions from that, is basically a sort of preview, in a sense, of game theoretic analyses of international relations. Game theory is where you finally actually write down all of the assumptions and make sure all of the logical deductions are as clear as they can be. And so I view sort of game theory as the sort of the logical conclusion or carrying out of the realist project in some ways. And in that regard, it makes sure, or gives you the greatest assurance that you are actually making clear logical deductions from premises. So what's going on in the game, in the NATO enlargement game? We have West, which can choose to expand its alliance or not expand, and then we have East after that choice, having a choice to expand or not expand. And I'm using the same words, but understand that these things could mean different things, right? This could be, say, you admit Poland to NATO or not. This could be you invade Ukraine or not. So at the minimum, expanding for West is much less costly because Poland wants to get into NATO than it is for East, who has to expand via force. It also, in a very realist sense, I think, elides and basically denies any moral distinction between admitting a NATO ally who wants to join, aka Poland, and conquering a foreign state, namely Russia attacking Ukraine. So just abstracting away from these sorts of distinctions, I just call it expand, not expand, expand, not expand. So if, sort of in the worst case, both sides expand and incorporate new allies or conquer new states, cooperation is sort of going down this side where both don't expand. If they don't expand, I'm saying normalizing the payoffs to 2, they sort of, there's sort of 2 allies here, like Poland and Ukraine, if you want to think of it that way. If both remain independent, both are sort of not, grabbed by the respective power. That gives each side a payoff of 2, one for each of those states. If you don't expand, if the West doesn't expand and the East does expand, then the West only gets 1 because it didn't expand, so it didn't grab the ally when it could. The other side gets 1 plus VE, which is this value for expansion if the other side doesn't expand, plus this G term, which is for your level of greed, which I think I talk about. I'll just talk about it briefly here, minus the cost of expansion. Whereas if both sides expand over here, the payoffs are this capital V, indicating the strategic benefit you get from expanding when the other side has expanded. So lowercase v is, I get Poland, but you don't take Ukraine, so I get sort of a little benefit from taking Poland. Capital V is, I get Poland and you get Ukraine. So getting Poland is more valuable to me because you got Ukraine. Conversely, getting Ukraine is more valuable to you because I got Poland. Right? So the closer NATO marches to the Russian borders, the more important it is for Russia to the greater the strategic incentive there is for Russia to expand as well. So this tries to capture this realist notion that the more the enemy sort of encroaches upon you, the greater the incentive you have to try to expand your frontiers as well. So capital V is bigger than lowercase v. So basically, for those of you who know a little bit of game theory anyway, in the assurance game, or stag hunt as it's often called, there's 2 equilibria, one in which both sides don't expand and they get 2, and one in which both sides expand and they get these more complicated payoffs. The strategic payoff from expansion when the other guy does 2, whatever greed factor you might have minus the cost. So those 2 equilibria correspond to like cooperation, where Eastern Europeans are allowed to sort of be independent little states without being in anybody's alliance, and competition when they're both both gobbled up. Okay, so let's see if okay. The basic driving force of the model, though, is that there's 2 types of each player, a security type and a greedy type, right? If you follow Charlie Glazer's work, this will be familiar to you. Right? The security-seeking type just basically wants to defend itself, just wants to sort of be left alone, only wants to expand if the other side is also expanding. Right? Is not driven of its own volition to expand, but only wants to do so in response to the other side. The greedy types want to expand even if the other side doesn't. So if you face a greedy type and you're the West, for instance, going first, and you don't expand, but they're greedy East, then they're going to expand anyway, even though you didn't. So you're uncertain about what type you're facing. And you're uncertain. East is also uncertain about West type, but as it turns out, since West moves first, East can figure that out pretty easily. So I went through the payoffs. G is this additional payoff for enlarging if you're the greedy type. And these are the assumptions that I just talked about in terms of if you're the security seeker type, you prefer only to expand if the other side is going to expand. If you're the greedy type, you would prefer to expand even if they're not. OK, is that relatively clear? Any questions about that? OK, so it's just a representation of this expansion dilemma with these two types. And there's two equilibria in the game, straightforwardly. A low trust equilibrium and a high trust equilibrium. 3 out of 4 player types do the same thing no matter what. So reading from the bottom, if you're the greedy East, you're moving last. You're the greedy type, well, of course, you're going to expand no matter what the West does, right? Because you have this internal, intrinsic interest to expand. If you're the security-seeking East, again, you're moving second. You're going to expand if the West expands as a response, but you're not going to expand otherwise. This is kind of what you're hoping for if you're West, that you're facing a security-seeking East. If you're the greedy West, you're going to expand no matter what your beliefs because you want to, right? You're driven by liberal pathologies or whatever it might be. You want to expand. But the security-seeking West faces the true dilemma. The security-seeking West is either going to expand or not expand. If they don't trust the East, if they think the East is likely to be greedy, they are going to expand. Why? Because they think if they don't expand, East is going to expand anyway, and they're going to be left with a resurgence of Eastern power that is unanswered by their own expansion, right? They'll essentially have trusted the other side only to be betrayed. But in the high trust equilibrium, they're not going to expand. Right? Here, they're not going to expand because they trust the East. Right? They think the East is a good guy, and therefore, East is not to be feared, and so they're going to not expand, hoping that East will reciprocate because it's security-seeking and will not expand because the West didn't expand. Right? So that's the basic layout of the model, and these are the two equilibria that there are in the game. Now, the theoretical point that I want to make with this, the bottom line for the model, offensive realism is embodied in the low trust equilibrium. That's the Mearsheimer equilibrium right here. This is the Mearsheimer equilibrium, the low trust equilibrium, where the security-seeking West expands. Why? Because it doesn't trust the other side. Because, as Mearsheimer says in many, many instances in his books, in his articles, you cannot trust the intentions of the other side. Right? You must assume that they are expansionists, that they are greedy, and act accordingly. So offensive realism is embodied in the low trust equilibrium. The security-seeking West enlarges because of mistrust, and therefore both types of East also enlarge. So that is offensive realism. But Mearsheimer's foreign policy argument is that the high trust equilibrium is what's going on. That's what explains NATO enlargement and the war. Trust is high. We know Putin is benignly motivated. And interestingly, if you've been following these Isaac Chotiner interviews in The New Yorker, Mearsheimer just gave a second one in which apparently I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but apparently he goes down even further along the lines of, we know that Putin's motivations are benign because he has said so. He has said so. He has told us that they are benign. Therefore, we know that. Right? How contradictory could you possibly get, right, to Mearsheimer's essential position, right? But he's, in the foreign policy, Mearsheimer argues, trust is high. Only the greedy West expands. Therefore, we know that the West expanded because of liberal ideology and pathologies. And the Eastern expansion is therefore predicated on the West's expansion. It's a response by a security-seeking East to a greedy West. Total contradiction. OK, how are we doing on time? OK. All right. So, but I'm arguing there's a bigger picture here. That is, this is not just Mearsheimer. It's not just one theorist and one conflict, not just Mearsheimer and Ukraine. It's actually much bigger than this. I'm arguing there's a disjuncture between realist theory and realist foreign policy going all the way back to the foundation of realism in the United States. And I've got 3 cases in for slides: Vietnam War, the nuclear debates of the 80s, and the contemporary grand strategy debate. So let's go through these in 15 minutes or less. So Vietnam, right? Vietnam is, of course, a sort of a war which led to enormous divisions within the United States over foreign policy. and enormous sort of controversy. Going back to the Vietnam War and the criticism of it, I think is sort of enlightening in some of these regards, right? Who's the big realist theory at this point in the Vietnam era? It's Hans Morgenthau, right? Morgenthau is like one of the founding realist theorists. He's right there in the 50s at this famous Rockefeller conference of realists, along with Reinhold Niebuhr and all these people like that. So Morgenthau is one of these defining realist thinkers in the United States, right? Morgenthau, the theorist, in the second edition of his Politics Among Nations, which has a very interesting first chapter, which wasn't present in the first one for a variety of interesting reasons. Anyway, has this famous passage where he talks about statesmen, as he characterized them at that point, which is mostly true, seek interest defined as power, right? Interest defined as power. And that if you think along those lines, if you think of statesmen as pursuing interest defined as power, you will understand their actions, possibly even better than they do themselves. That's how you understand the world, by thinking of statesmen pursuing the national interest defined as power. So that's the foundation. That's the core theoretical assumption, right? Notice that sort of prefigures Waltzingism, but it doesn't go through this whole security thing. That's kind of implicit in the background. He just says states seek power. Okay. Morgenthau, the foreign policy critic. So you might think that they would say, okay, seeking power, you're going to use force a lot. You're going to be pretty active abroad. You're going to be try to crush foreign adversaries and impose your will here and there. Morgenthau, the foreign policy critic, however, was an early and emphatic critic of the Vietnam War. And there's this great book which gathers together all of his essays on this topic, which you can check out at the library, like I did, and be the first person since 1972 to check that book out. But it's well worth reading if you're interested in this sort of stuff. Vietnam is a foreign policy disaster. It's caused by overly aggressive American foreign policy elites who are motivated to protect their myths and imaginary worlds from contact with the real world to the point of psychopathology. So very different seeming from his theoretical perspective. Now, I actually acknowledge in the paper that you can make a realist case against the Vietnam War, against getting involved in Vietnam, right? It's pretty straightforward. Vietnam is basically low stakes. Like, doesn't really matter that much who rules Vietnam. Low chance of success because the South Vietnamese regime was weak and corrupt. And high cost because of what I just said, means the American troops would have to fight in the jungles of Vietnam, which is unlikely to be cheap. Right? So low stakes, low likelihood of success, and high cost means don't do it from a simple expected utility perspective, which realism is founded on. Right? So there is a realist case to oppose the Vietnam War. I'm not saying there isn't. It certainly is. However, Morgenthau, in a lot of his auxiliary arguments on this topic, makes a bunch of arguments which are, in my view, sort of foreshadow arguments that are made to this day. One is this argument about psychopathology of American foreign policy elites, which is very much foreshadowing the Steve Waltzian, the blob thesis that we'll get to in a second. But he's also arguing Hanoi, Moscow, and Beijing, if they're mentioned at all, are mentioned as essentially benign security seekers, defensively motivated, right? Hardly, interested in. They're worried about the United States, right? He quotes the famous Burke statement, Edmund Burke, about about Great Britain, the danger of becoming too powerful and attracting this opposing coalition. Worries that the United States is doing that. Basically, he makes these extremely benign arguments about the other side's motivations in this context, which don't hold up to reality in terms of if you actually look at what the motivations were of these states and what they were actually doing, right? I mean, to the extent of supporting the sort of left-wing argument that this is a civil war in South Vietnam and North Vietnam's not really involved, we shouldn't think of it as an international conflict at all. Essentially making all these very benign assumptions about what was going on the other side. Which were not true, nor were they consistent with his theory. So I think that sort of foreshadows a lot of what you see later on. Nuclear war and the nuclear debates of the 1980s. So here, The nuclear debates and debates over nuclear strategy are very complex. There's all kinds of technical aspects. Nobody knows that better than here, right? I'm sort of coming to the ground zero of nuclear strategy here. So I don't need to tell you guys about that. But I will boil it down and simplify it to a debate between two camps for the purposes of this paper. And argument 1, the mad camp, and 2, the war fighting. And I would say that the first place where I was exposed to this was in Kenoy's international relations class in Princeton in like 1984. So this is like, you're just getting your lecture back to you right now, which I now give myself. So the mad philosophy is, look, once the United States and the Soviets get enough nuclear weapons so that they can survive an all-out first strike by the other side and retaliate with sufficient devastation to make the other side regret what they had done, then you've got what's known as mutually assured destruction. And the mad philosophy is that's not a strategy, that's not an option, that's a recognition of reality. That's the truth about the matter. That's where we are, right? Once you have that many nuclear weapons, first strikes, splendid first strikes, which wipe out the enemy's forces entirely, are impossible. There will always be a second strike, which makes you regret what you did. And therefore, the purpose of nuclear weapons at that point becomes to deter their use by others. It has no other purpose. That's the mad philosophy, right? Therefore, nuclear arsenals are not to be sized like conventional forces to outmatch the other side, right? You don't care how many nuclear weapons the other side because you're not trying to destroy them. What you care about is how many cities the other side has and whether you can effectively destroy those even after the enemy launches their first strike against you. If the answer is yes, that's enough. So you don't engage in arms racing, you don't engage in all this other stuff because you're not trying to be better or have more than the other side. You're trying to accomplish this mission of essentially annihilating the enemy's population after you've received a first strike. And if you can do that, deterrence holds, right? What about if you have more ambitious goals, like you want to protect Western Europe, but you're too cheap to buy the conventional forces required to do so? Well, then you have threats that leave something to chance, right? The threat that leaves something to chance is what Schelling, one of Schelling's contributions, which is this notion that you can't, in a mad world, you can't actually threaten deliberate use of nuclear weapons because that's crazy. It's mad, right? You can't, a first strike is insane. What you can do, though, is you can ratchet up the tensions a bit. You can do something which makes an accidental nuclear war more likely, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis provides all kinds of examples. You have the quarantine around Cuba. You know, who knows what might happen, right? A submarine might come up against an anti-submarine patrol. The captain of the ship might do something you don't know about, right? So you're ratcheting up the tension. You're going to a higher level of alert. You're making accidental war more likely. That's the threat that leaves something to chance, which will suffice to exert at least a limited amount of coercive leverage, preferentially in defense of the status quo. Okay, so that's basically the mad philosophy. The war-fighting philosophy says, no, that's all junk, right? Mad is a choice, it's a strategy, it's defeatism, right? And we should be better than that, right? We want nuclear weapons to be more numerous than the Russians. We are arms racing. Nuclear weapons are just like any other kind of weapon. We want better, more, faster, more accurate in every regard than the Soviets have. We want specifically to have credible first strike options. We want to have the ability to take out the Soviet arsenal in a first strike. Why? Because that gives us leverage. Credible threats to use nuclear weapons are the only thing that deters, not this nebulous threats that leave something to chance. What else do you want? You want tactical nuclear weapons located in Europe in order to act as more credible options in case the Soviets were to invade Western Europe, et cetera. So it's a very different philosophy of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. You might think that realists, assuming that the world is a conflictual place, assuming that states pursue power, assuming that you can't tell what the motivations of other states are, and assuming that they have to assume that they're as bad as they could be, might support warfighting. In fact, they almost universally support MAD. The realists lined up behind MAD 100%. They wrote books saying how great MAD was and how illogical the alternative was. So the realists, despite their theory being hawkish, were in favor of the dovish strategy when it came to nuclear weapons. One of the driving forces behind that, which I sort of allude to but don't develop a lot, is the realists tended to assume that the Soviets were defensively minded security seekers who could be easily deterred by absurd threats like threats that leave something to chance, right? The war fighters assumed that the Soviets were ruthless, power-seeking bastards, and the only way to deter them was to threaten them with personal annihilation or at least losing power in the war, right? Not even the cost of millions of fatalities in the Soviet Union would be enough to deter them because they are so brutal and ruthless and power-seeking. You need to threaten their personal survival and their hold on power. Well, which is more consonant with realism, right? Saying that they are defensively minded security seekers who just want to get along but are misunderstood, or thinking that they are hard-nosed, ruthless power seekers who can only be deterred if you can threaten their hold on power. I mean, Mearsheimer's theory is pretty clear on which of those two things would be the case. Okay, I have a whole nother thing about World War I in that case, but there's sort of this sublimated debate about World War I that took place in the 80s at the same time, which I argue misinterpreted the origins of World War I along similar lines. But I can answer that in Q&A if you want. Okay, finally, grand strategy and the blob. Right, so this current debate about grand strategy, what should the United States grand strategy be? And there's almost universal agreement amongst the realists that restraint is the grand strategy of choice here, right? Dash, Walt, Mearsheimer are all lined up behind this notion that there's this thing called the blob, which controls US foreign policy. There's no difference between Democrats and Republicans. It's driven by the career concerns of the US foreign policy establishment. What does the blob do? The blob pursues liberal hegemony. Liberal hegemony is this ideology which unites Democrats and Republicans in hegemonic fashion. Liberal hegemony is democracy promotion, is international institutions, is open borders, all of these things. So we, the United States, because of domestic pathologies, are captured by this blob that pursues liberal hegemony because of the career concerns of foreign policy establishment. Other states are defensively minded security seekers, states like Russia, states like Iran, states like China. And so if we were to pursue restraint or offshore balancing or one of these other terms that are used, the world would be more peaceful. It'd be a better place, right? Threats would go away. If you read Steve Walt's book on this topic, right, he actually argues that if we had not been involved in the Middle East, if we didn't support Israel and other aspects of our involvement in the Middle East, maybe 9/11 wouldn't have happened. Maybe we would have perfectly friendly relations with the Iranian regime, et cetera. So it's this whole story of, you used to have this term primate in politic, the primacy of the domestic politics. It's all a domestic politics story about what's going on and how the United States is sort of uniquely captured by this foreign policy bureaucracy, which is making us expansionist. And no other domestic story matters, right? Not democracy versus authoritarianism in the rest of the world, not Putin versus somebody else, not Xi Jinping versus Hu Jintao. No other domestic story in the world matters. This one does, right? The one about the United States is the one that matters and is driving the whole thing. So it's obviously incompatible with realism. I mean, I hardly need to emphasize that, I hope, right? It's completely incompatible with realism as a theory. So I won't get into the specific details of the authors. I go through a bunch of different books by a bunch of different people in this sort of, in this genre, but that's the basic argument. Okay, so conclusion. Realist foreign policy, I'm arguing, is not derived from realist theory. Realist theory is hawkish. Realist foreign policy is dovish. Now note, that's actually not unique to realism, right? Most academic foreign policy commentary is dovish. It's rare that you find academics who are more hawkish even than Democratic administrations, much less Republican administrations. I can think of a few people like Matt Koenig or somebody like that. There's a few out there who want to be in those sorts of roles. In some cases, right? So usually academics are kind of a dovish lot. All I'm pointing out here is that the realists are sort of adopting this hawkish stand or pose to justify their dovish foreign policy recommendations in a way that's inconsistent, logically speaking. And you might say, well, but Andy, what's wrong with that, right? Why? Like, if I think it's good, like, that the United States be more dovish, and I certainly think that the wars of the 2000s, which I characterize as neoconservative rather than liberal, were enormous mistakes. Why shouldn't I support this sort of sleight of hand that the realists are engaged in, pretending that their foreign policy of restraint is actually implied by their theory? And the reason I sort of getting back to like an overall macro point, which I didn't really emphasize at the beginning, I think it's very important that we as academics in our foreign policy advocacy are very clear where we are voicing our opinions versus where we are presenting the results of scholarship. And presenting the results of scholarship means, in the case of empirical work, it means like you did some empirical work, right? You have a data set, you did quantitative work on it, or you have a bunch of case studies, right? These are the results of my empirical scholarship. I think that's great, right? Bridging the gap, I'm all for it. That's fantastic. But when as scholars, we give advice, especially emphatic advice, which has nothing to do with our actual scholarly product. And in the case of realists, their scholarly product is theoretical expositions, right? That's what they do, right? That's what they have for the most part. Well, that's what they're bringing to bear in this sort of theoretical debate. It's got to be consistent with that theory, otherwise it's just their opinion, right? And I think it undermines the public's trust, or it could in theory at least undermine the public's trust, in the whole academic enterprise if people are going off like Noam Chomsky or Steven Pinker, right? They're linguists, right? And they're writing enormous book after book about foreign policy, right? Well, I don't care what they think about foreign policy because they don't know about it, right? They're not trained in it. It's obviously ideological product, right? So I think we need to be very careful about making sure that our foreign policy advice is in fact derived from our scholarly product and our scholarly expertise. Because if it isn't, we are undermining any public faith in the objectivity or the possibility of objective inquiry of the academic enterprise. And we make ourselves seem like simply a bunch of opinionated know-it-alls who write whatever we think without any basis in actual scholarship. So on that slightly controversial note, I'll leave it.
Great. I'm going to be keeping a list. We may just all be bloviating know-it-alls, so maybe we should just, write that down into the talk there. I saw Kunal first. Keep hands up, and this is the point at which I'm going to forget many names. So I will try to get everybody. Kunal? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. This was very interesting. I'm Kunal Singh, fourth year PhD student at the SSP. The critique seemed to me like focus a lot on whether you can correctly judge whether an actor is security seeker or a greedy by nature. But in realist theory, it's not just judging that, and the level of trust is not just determined by that, but it's also determined by technology and geography. For example, realists argued restraint mad because they thought nukes was a defense-dominant technology. They argued for restraint vis-a-vis Russia because US was, as surrounded by oceans, was more secure, they thought, than Russia was. So I think it kind of little bit ignores technology and geography.
Sure. I mean, I think that's, realists make these arguments, and I think I do respond a bit to the geography in the paper. Mearsheimer has this argument about the stopping power of water and regional hegemony and saying the states want regional hegemony. But I would argue that that goes against his fundamental theory, really. It's kind of an ad hoc addition to it, like an epicycle back in the days of Ptolemy. It's sort of, the fundamental thing is, do you want to let rivals, potential rivals, amass power? To say that Russia is less of a threat than it was in 1985, in 1995, is true. But then the question is, do you want to let it get back to 1985 again? And the answer should be no. Of course you don't. And so you should prevent that from happening. So I think the notion, this sort of idea that the stopping power of water, and that just means that we shouldn't care about Russia, is inconsistent with the more fundamental aspects of his theory.
All right. Barry.
So, I've never asked John why he called his book The Tragedy of International Politics. But I think most structural realists are alive to the anarchy-driven temptation to keep grabbing until someone stops you. And realists are also alive to the incentive that anarchy offers others to try and stop you. So structural realists, and I think, I kind of agree with your little side excursion on John and the stuff in Power Clark. I think structural realists in general believe that states will, because of their situation, try and grab for all the power they can. Structural realists also predict that this probably will not turn out well. The same cause tells you that you will grab and that it will not turn out well. So when structural realists turn to the task of advising states, which is a different task, they ask, what did the theory teach me about how the world works? And what advice can I now give to statesmen based on my prediction about how the world works? And Morgenthau, somewhere in some page somewhere, I believe he says he has a little discussion of the word prudence. Morgenthau never really separates his is's and his oughts. That's a different generation of theory. But when he moves to oughts, he says that the first rule is prudence, right? So when a structural realist like me recommends a strategy of restraint, he recommends that, or she, or some, recommends the strategy of restraint on the basis of the expectation of the tragedy. Now, we are also armed with other realist-based calculations, which is, what is the power and security position of the United States? What is the power and security position of Russia? How much cushion do we have? How much risk do we assume by not being this voracious Pac-Man international power eater? And we say, not that much, right? So I would say, as the unnamed, one of the unnamed
unindicted co-conspirator.
That I see my recommendations for U.S. grand strategy following from my understanding of this tragedy, as it follows from the depiction of realism as a positive theory that you provided. And I understand the seduction of doing too much, and the way that the doing too much can end up with me being more soft, right? And also the other facts of the case, which I'll allude to, which allow me to experiment with that, to give me some wiggle room as a statesman. So I'm wondering why or how do you think that my understanding of structural realism is not informing the advice that I'm trying to give to statesmen? Now, you may say that I'm deluded. Yeah, that's fine. but it seems to me that the logic is pretty clear. So tell me more.
Sure. So my answer to that, which I have in the paper but not in, I didn't have it in the talk, I guess, is, so when you have theory and when you have foreign policy advice, the question is, when can they be different? And so I think you're right that structural realism predicts states will grab power and that will lead to conflict, possibly even war, and that's unfortunate. But they're doing that because they are rationally pursuing security under anarchy in a condition of opacity of motivations. That's the Mearsheimer story there. So if your advice then to statesmen is to say, don't do that, do less of that, stop short, what is that based on? It's got to be based on one of two things. One is you don't want the state to actually be secure and survive under anarchy, which indicts your patriotism, which is not going on, obviously, but that's one possibility. Like you could easily say to a state like Russia, if you're adversarial, don't compete for power. That's bad. Don't do that. But that's because you don't care about Russian survival. If you care about American survival, and your theory says states seek power in order to survive in the international system, to say don't do that is a problem. Now, it's not a problem if you think the theory is, as you were alluding to, states do it too much. States overcompete. States are prone to exaggerate the threat and grab too much. But that's not a realist theory. That's a psychological theory. That says there is an amount which would be the rational amount to grab, but states are going power. Not a realist theory. That's a psychological theory of overestimation and overgrabbing and overextension. And if that's your theory, it's fine to say, don't do that.
I think it's certainly a good theory, but it's not the theory that I just advanced. So don't mischaracterize the theory that I just advanced. The theory I just advanced is that a structural realist understands that all states are interested in security and that power is a means to get security. The temptation is to grab as much power as you can, but the predicted outcome is that others will push back, right? And it's the interaction of your desire for security and their desire for security and the pursuit of power to get safe that produces the war, right? So following from that understanding, we make an advice to statesmen, this particular state in this particular place, under these conditions, right? You don't need world domination to be secure. That's what the theory might predict that states will strive for. This theory also predicts that the odds of you getting it are very low, and the costs of trying are incredibly high. And therefore, when we shift to advising for foreign policy, we say, you should stop and think. Stop and think. So I didn't say anything about the other matter. The states are misperceiving and misidentifying all the power that they need. I didn't offer you a cognitive or psychology theory at any time. I stayed inside the theory as you detected it.
Okay, why do you have to offer the advice? If the rational amount of expansion is X, why is it that you need to offer foreign policy advice saying don't go beyond X? Why aren't they already doing that? If your theory is correct.
We can all debate on where the point is, on how to measure it, on when the other guy is gonna push back, when you're going to be in the other guy's face. We can all debate that. Right? And that's going to be a function of geography, technology, economics.
Okay. One other way of expressing it in game theoretic terms is, so you made this argument that if we both sides pursue power as dictated by structural realism, they may end up in this bad outcome, war, right? So think of it as a prisoner's dilemma, right? Compete, not compete. Mutual competition, that's the bad outcome. That's the 2-2, right? But in the prisoner's dilemma, it's a dominant strategy to compete. If you think they're not going to compete, you should compete because then you'll get an advantage. If you think they are going to compete, you should certainly compete because otherwise you're going to be at a disadvantage. The whole point of the tragedy...
We're not talking about competition and non-competition. We're talking about how much competition. That's what we're talking about in the real world, how much competition. There's never any argument by the likes of me or any other of the people we talk about there that the United States should disarm itself. Is there?
No. But the question is, in this logic, the result, the tragedy, right, the whole tragic outcome of the conflict is not necessarily one to be avoided, because the alternative, the counterfactual, is they get an advantage which you don't contest. Now, obviously, there could be, right, you know, it's more continuous, it's not just two strategies. But the fact that competition leads to war in structural realism is not an indictment of competition. It's expected, and not necessarily to be recommended against, right? That's what the theory predicts.
So I'm going to
from rational behavior.
It also, I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but in any time and place, it depends on your calculation of the gains of war and the costs of war. Right? And there's, from my point of view, there's been a secular increase in the cost going up to the nuclear world.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're thinking about that tool and that outcome is central to the national security of your state in that realist world.
So I'm enjoying this immensely. I cannot underscore how much I'm enjoying this, but I am going to get some.
It's unclear for me to continue, so I will stop.
I'm gonna get some other voices in on this. Maria, I saw you flinching. Was that a two-finger on this? Or?
I'm not flinching, but I won't judge. But you just clarify the question. Does competition mean expansion in the game?
In the game that I just presented, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and you do want in on the queue eventually. Yeah,
I'm
okay.
going to, I'll see him afterwards. So
Oh, that's true. Okay, Anne Sartori.
Okay, so let me follow up on this very interesting conversation from a game theoretic perspective. So, in a completely rational world, it seems to me that you don't give policy advice because policymakers are already optimizing, right? So if the right thing to do is to admit Poland, they do it, and if it isn't, they don't do it, and they know the game, and they know everything, and they act rationally, right? So it seems to me that to start giving policy advice, you have to admit some kind of at least bounded rationality. You have to admit that policymakers don't know everything about the situation, so that you need to be giving them some kind of advice about how to maximize the state's interests, however you define them. If that's the case, then I think you might have to kind of admit Barry's argument that, you know, they might not, yes, it might be good for us to invest more in our security in various ways, maybe so far as expanding, but maybe they don't know exactly, maybe we know. Maybe there's something about the situation that experts know that the policymakers don't know, that, you know, so we have to tell them where is the right amount, or where is the right amount, the worthwhile places to expand, and where maybe you should stop because it's not worth investing your resources because they'll counter it, because whatever. There's something about the situation the policymakers don't know.
Okay. No, I think that's good. That's right. I think that's a good point. So there's a couple of articles that I cite in the paper on this whole question of, like, if realist theory was correct, why are realists complaining about foreign policy so much? So those would be, they're in the early, like in the introduction, I forget the names, but they're there. Yeah, and in a way, this whole debate presumes a broader model which incorporates both the decision makers and the advisors, presumably including kibitzers like me or people around the table or whatever, who don't actually have any influence on anything. But
that much is clear. We have very little influence.
So, and in a sense, that's what Walt's blob thesis is, right? So one response to that is, if that were true, if realist theory were true, if you sort of couch this within a world in which you think the realist theory is true, but we're all offering advice about where that threshold is, where we ought to compete up to this threshold but not beyond. And we're all offering different advice about that based on our own little pieces of knowledge that we might have in some sort of counter-state jury theorem sort of world. right? That's fine. But then what would you say of a school of thought or practitioners whose advice is constantly on the, it should be at x minus 50 when we perceive the mean to be at x, right? You would say, well, there must be a bias here, right? They're always recommending be less engaged, more restraint. That would, so the prima facie argument or inference would be realists must be biased, they must be dovish, right? The Waltzian, Walt, no Z, counter-argument would be, no, the realists aren't biased. Their right is the foreign policy establishment that's biased because of career concerns. So if you actually think that the blob exists and is driven by career concerns, or the military-industrial complex, to use earlier terms, right? That there is something innate in the American government, either in state or defense or whatever, which drives it to be x plus 50, or like if say the rational level is x, the establishment gives you x plus 50, and the realists are just saying, no, it should be that thing minus 50, back to x. That's a coherent theory. But it's a domestic politics story, right? Then again, we're sort of saying realism doesn't actually explain the world because it's domestic pathologies that explain the world. Realism explains normatively what the true value ought to be, x minus 50. So that's another way of defending it, which I think gets it to this whole question of, is realism an objective theory about the world, as its proponents like to claim, or is it in fact a normative theory about what policy ought to be? Which I would say actually game theory is a normative theory about what policy ought to be. People try to make it positive, and in some cases it may be helpful, but it's primarily a normative theory about what you should do if you're rational, and you assume other people are rational too. That's what game theory does for you, right? In a sense, that's what realism does for you, potentially. That's one way to look at it.
All right, I'm pulling in Suzanne Freeman.
Sorry.
I don't know that I'm the first person who wants to go after all that, but here I am. Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm a fourth year PhD student. I think my question is maybe about something very specific, which is that in your Vietnam case, you're using Morgenthau as your sort of realist example, and I understand the reason you're doing that is you want to say that it's sort of this distinction that you're drawing goes back to the beginning of realist theory. But Morgenthau's conception of realism is dramatically different than what comes after with structural realism, that he is using like domestic level variables in a real way. And so I think historically I can see why you're using it, but does sort of the dramatic differences between classical realism and structural realism, does that create a problem for you?
Well, this is going to be a short answer because the true answer is I don't know. I mean, I'm reaching back to Morgenthau because he's a prominent figure and he's a prominent opponent, he's a prominent foreign policy critic of the war, and I thought that his criticism was largely inconsistent with his theory. Yeah, I mean, I don't make as much of the distinction between Waltz and Morgenthau and Mearsheimer as other people do. Like, people talk about Morgenthau saying people have an innate will for power. I'm not really sure that's really that big a distinction between his ultimate theory and what Mearsheimer comes up with, because the ultimate, when the rubber hits the road, it's states pursuing power. So I guess I don't think it's a huge difference, but I could be wrong on that.
Nick Acker, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Rich. Hi, Andrew. My name's Nick Acker, and I'm also a fourth-year PhD student. Just on the point that the distinctions between these different variants of realism don't matter, is there an argument to be made that they actually do because they affect the assumptions that underlie realism as a foreign policy versus realism as a theory? So when I initially heard the typology as you presented it, I was a little bit confused because I had always associated realist theory to actually be more inherently defensive. Like, one of the first things I interpreted from reading Waltz's book is that if you overextend, the system smacks you back, and it's the hawkish decisions of individual policymakers that defy those theoretical expectations that really create problems. So I guess in a nutshell, do those distinctions matter precisely because they affect the kinds of assumptions that we have going into what defines realism as a policy versus realism?
Yeah, I think so. I guess the example that I would point to that I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I talk about a little bit in the paper, is defensive realism, right? Defensive realism is really explicitly about this notion that you shouldn't overact the spiral model, the deterrence model, right? You can signal aggressive intentions that gets you in trouble, right? You should try to reassure the other side, build trust. all that stuff is antithetical to offensive realism. And but if you believe all that, then you have a much more nuanced view of international relations, which is consonant with a lot of these sort of restraint arguments. That said, I think there's an argument to be made that people like Charlie Glaser, who's like a leading defensive realist, are even more dovish than his foreign policy, than his theory would indicate, right, in terms of giving up Taiwan, getting out of Saudi Arabia. I mean, you can make that argument. I had a discussion with him about that. He thinks it's obviously consistent. But yeah, I think that the defensive realist argument is, you know, much better in that regard. So,
Kenway.
So the tension that you postulated between realist theory and realist foreign policy recommendations hinges on your interpretation of realist theory and the people that you've chosen to put in that box. Your last response took us into the world of jurists, right? And as you noted rightly, game theory is prescriptive. Okay? But if you look at the theories associated with jurists, and they're not psychological theories in this instance, or you reason from that to others that would fit into that camp, George Kennan and the Koshin-Kortunov crowd in Russia, the New Thinkers. In all those cases, you have people who are at once realist theorists with sensitivity to the considerations Harry was talking about, pushback, flashback, eliciting spirals of hostility, that are entirely consistent with the foreign policy recommendations that they make, be it Kennan on Vietnam or on Reagan. And I'm thinking here about Kennan's support for criticisms of Reagan foreign policy by Steve and by Gary. Or if you turn to the New Thinkers, it's classic juristine thought. So is that tension that you're postulating really resting a little too much on John and not on a whole bunch of thinkers that I think are fairly characterized as realists, whose thinking embodies at its core a sensitivity to reactions and responses?
Okay, so that's a great point. Someone asked me, I think it might have been Danny Ryder, does this paper lose all reason for being if John Mearsheimer got up at a conference tomorrow and said, actually, I'm a defensive realist. Sorry about all the offensive realism stuff.
He won't, though, so it's...
I changed my mind. It's really, Charlie was right all along. Sorry about that, right? And to some extent, yes, that's true. It kind of does pull away a lot of the point here. The tension is clearest, I think, in his thinking, but as I say, I think it's apparent elsewhere. Where I would say there's still some residual tension is that, yes, defensive realism, Jervis, security dilemma, spiral model, Charlie's thing, my early writings on this topic, all point to this possibility of spirals, unnecessary spirals of hostility, the importance of reassurance, the importance of communication, the cost of signaling, arms control, all the rest of it. You can take that too far. Right, you can take that to the point where, right, there's no building trust with untrustworthy people. The problem is not always a lack of trust, or lack of trust is not always the problem. Sometimes the problem is a lack of trustworthiness, right? It's another thing I learned from you in the book.
This is unfair. No one should ever be.
No, I know, especially by a guy with gray hair. Think horses before you think zebra, right? That has stuck with me ever since, right? If you're dealing with the Soviet Union and you wonder, why, or with Putin today, you're wondering, why is it so hard to get cooperation going? Like my overtures, they seem to be being refused consistently. What's going on here? Well, one possibility is you haven't tried hard enough and you should make even more concessions. The other possibility is they're not interested, right? They are actually greedy. And so you should give up on that, right? And the whole, Osgood and Grit is all thinking about that very problem, right? How long do you go with a reconciliation type policy before, while it's failing? I mean, if it succeeds, obviously that's great. But if it fails, how long do you stick with it until you give up on it and say these guys are unredeemable? We're just going to have to go back to conflict, right? And I think there's a tendency amongst, again, academics, I think we're all doves, right, for the most part, right? Our tendency is to stick with it longer than the evidence indicates.
I actually have several two fingers on this one. First is from Ben Harris.
Sure, this is the same as my normal one finger. I'm really happy to have multiple generations of Ken students arguing with each other about what Ken says. But to follow on Ken's point, I think one specification that I disagree with, that I think explains a lot of the disjointedness you talk about in your presentation, is like how you define security seeking. And it seems that you implicitly define security seeking as power maximization, which is like an explicitly like Mearsheimer version of realism. But I think that the power not equaling security is fundamental to the security dilemma branch of realism. And that shows up in two case examples, first for nuclear weapons and second for NATO expansion. In the case of nuclear weapons, I think Jervis would be described or would be surprised to hear the meaning of the nuclear revolution described as a policy book, not a theory book. And like he explicitly says, like MAD is a fact, not a policy. And I think that book argues, okay, if we're maximizing security and reducing the risk of nuclear war, this leads to a different outcome than if we're trying to maximize power. And secondly, for NATO expansion, I also disagree with the argument that NATO expansion increased US power vis-a-vis Russia, or increased US security vis-a-vis Russia. Because adding the Baltic states to the NATO alliance did practically nothing for US power against Russia. However, I think it dramatically decreased security because it increased the risk of war by increasing the chances for misperception, the stakes of conflict, all of the things that Jervis would talk about. And so I don't think that you can understand NATO expansion in terms of security maximization because it didn't even achieve that. I think if you look at the history, it has to do a lot with like the particular liberal politics of the moment. And I think you also can't discount the agency of the NATO aspirants themselves, who in part forced the United States and the rest of the alliance's hand. But thank you for the presentation.
Sure, just two brief points. One, I would say I certainly am not saying power equals security. In fact, I'm arguing the exact opposite. My point is that power is not security. Security is positive sum, power is zero sum. So those are very different goals. Mearsheimer wants to say the search for security leads inexorably to the search for power because we can't tell motivations. Motivations are fundamentally opaque. That's how he squares that circle. Morgenthau, much more straightforwardly, I think, says states seek power, period. I don't need to justify that. So, but I'm saying, and the defense of realists are saying, power is not equal to security. In terms of the NATO, like one possible explanation here is that what happened is, there we go. We're in an equilibrium where both NATO, the West, the US, and Russia are greedy, right? We want to expand because we think that our expansion is not a bad thing. We think it's fine. We think it's good for the Europeans to have the choice of what alliance to be part of. So you can count that as greed in the terms of this model. The Russians want to expand because they want to dominate the periphery. And so it's two greedy states butting heads, right? It's not security at all. So that's another possible explanation.
Carol,
I have a slightly different approach, and if my question is totally
no, sure, Carol,
please
the floor is yours.
What role does knowledge play in all of this? And I'm thinking as an area specialist, as someone who knows Russia, engaging with the NATO expansion debate from that angle as opposed to from just the realist theory angle, what role does someone like me, who knows a lot about Russia and can make an assessment of Russian motivations, of Russian capabilities, et cetera, what roles does he or she play in this whole debate that you're talking about? And the second point that I want to make is, or my question I want to ask is, where do the new NATO members fit into this paradigm that you're talking about? What do you do about a Poland or a Hungary or a Czech Republic that comes to NATO and says, we hate the Russians, we don't trust them, we want in, as opposed to just always assuming that it was the United States that sought to expand?
So yeah, I think the knowledge thing gets back to the debate we were having about, right, what do we think is, what's our model of the foreign policy making process, right? And if we think that it's unbiased, then the knowledge could reduce the variance, right, and make the choices more closely map onto reality, which is good. If it's biased, then maybe it might help counteract that bias. But if it's a strong bias motivated by something other than the truth, then it might be ignored essentially. But I think one has to have a more fully developed model, really, of the foreign policy advice process to capture that adequately, which would be worth, actually, it's interesting as a possibility here. Like, you could actually do that. Okay, anyway. What about NATO? Like, one thing, there's no agency here for the NATO states, for Ukraine, for Poland, for anybody, for the Baltics, right? So, all the people, all of my like staunch Eastern European emigre friends would like hate this because you're just as bad as Mearsheimer because there's no agency for them. So, guilty, right, as charged. On the other hand, you can kind of incorporate it in some ways in terms of the parameters of the model, in terms of the costs involved in accepting these members. I wouldn't necessarily say, which a lot of realists I think argue, there's no strategic value in any of these countries, right? I mean, some of the ones in the Balkans, like, who cares, right? But the Baltic states, right? Keeping Russia further away from the Baltic Sea, that seems like a good thing. I don't know. Maybe not a huge thing, but certainly keeping them out of Poland, keeping them out of Ukraine would be great. So I don't denigrate the strategic value of NATO expansion. I don't think it's. I mean, it may have been driven primarily by these sorts of ideological concerns, but I think there's definitely a strategic case to be made in some of these cases anyway. Certainly the sort of main axis, like closest to Russia ones.
Is it on this point or? All right, Steve, any breath.
Thanks, Andy, for a really great talk. Really appreciate it. How would you react to the way I would have characterized the difference between offensive and defensive realists? So I think of a very different, both understanding world affairs and also very different foreign policies. I would have said they disagree not so much about how they describe the intentions of other countries, but mostly about power and how power works. And they have three disputes about power between each other. One is defensive realists think conquest is hard, and offensive realists think it's not so hard. Defensive realists also believe it's especially hard in the nuclear age, and that sort of changes everything. It reduces your need for power or for security because you're already secure because it's so hard for people to conquer you. And also you should maybe pull in your horns and not be aggressive because if you try to aggress, it won't work. That's a belief about power. Second belief is about what are the results of intimidation in the world? Do states balance or bandwagon when you put a knife to their neck or put a fist under their chin? An offensive realist might think bandwagoning is kind of common, intimidation works, good way to make friends. A defensive realist would say, well, no, when you put a fist under the other guy's chin, you tend to make them form a posse and they come after you. And it's an argument we should kind of finish, frankly, in the world, because I think sort of European history is very strong, showing balancing prevails. If you look at the ancient Mediterranean or ancient China or ancient India, it doesn't seem to be true. Okay, fine, let's figure that one out. And they disagree about basically, does power help you make friends, or does it cow others into making a posse against you? And the third is, are resources cumulative? If you do expand, does it add to your both offensive and defensive power? And has that changed over time? Peter Liberman argued that conquests of industrial regions were kind of cumulative in his great book. He's one of our former students, and so I love his book because he was great. Does conquest pay? But then, is that still true? Is it true in the age of knowledge economies? Can you really conquer Seattle and make people at Microsoft generate military power for you in the way you conquered the Ruhr and make the steelworkers go to work? So how cumulative is and the defensive realists would say things aren't cumulative. Empires are usually millstones. They take more trouble to police than the power or wealth you can harvest from. An offensive realist would say the opposite. So what would you say to this? It's an argument about power and how it works.
So those are great points. I haven't really thought about that in terms of this particular debate. I guess I think they're good and well taken points. I guess one question is that the argument that we're seeing? And maybe I just had missed it, but are the critics of NATO enlargement causing Russian expansion saying it doesn't? The reason we shouldn't care whether Russia conquers Ukraine or the rest of these states is because power isn't cumulative anymore, and so that's going to be a weakening of Russian power rather than a strengthening of Russian power. I think Putin clearly thought it was a strengthening, or would lead to a strengthening, in part because he thought the cost would be low, right? There's sort of linked factors there, right? He thought the cost would be low. He'd just march into Kyiv and just kick the door in and take over. So conquest would be cheap, and resources would be cumulative. And I think that's what the US feared. But I haven't seen that as a central plank of the anti-NATO enlargement argument, saying, we actually don't need to worry about this anymore, because even if he retook the Soviet Empire and established dominance over Eastern Europe, it just wouldn't matter. But I would be interested. But I mean, I think that's a different argument and a worthwhile one. But
I wrote a piece about the security value of Ukraine years before this war, making that case.
Where was it?
I don't even remember.
So I guess I don't have a very well formulated response to that, just because I haven't been reading those factors in this particular debate. But I think that's an interesting point. Yeah.
We're reaching the point where there is much more interest in this talk than we have time. I'm going to batch questions. So our first batch will have Zach Burdett and Chap Lawson. So try to hold your answer until they both ask the questions.
Got it. Thanks. It's clearly very stimulating, and I'm tempted to cede my time back to Barry, but instead I'll build on one of his points of kind of thinking about the odds of getting something are low, but the cost of trying are high, how that plays into this. So the big picture question is whether these structural theories of realism can make a determinate prediction about specific nuclear doctrines in that case study. So it seems there's a structural theory, an arrow, and then a specific military doctrine with kind of a binary choice that, like, if we had longer to discuss, I actually think is missing a bunch of variations in how you can apply that doctrine. But I'm curious, I think the thing missing there is there's this middle box of mechanisms that includes causal beliefs, like Ben highlighted, about the theory of the nuclear revolution, where different realists disagree about those things, but also some technical questions about operational feasibility. So one could say that the risks of, for example, being able to achieve a splendid first strike capability are high because it prompts costly and risky countermeasures on the other side. Your probability of accomplishing it are extremely low because of the offense-defense balance in that competition. You're sapping resources from other investments in either welfare, just be a happier state, or if from the purely structural standpoint of conventional capabilities can give you an edge. Basically, the point being that there are real opportunity costs. It's probably not going to happen, and there's some real escalation risks of doing this. But so I'm kind of curious if, without those second-order pieces of information, how you can make a determinate prediction that realists have said this and therefore are wrong.
And Chap.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. So I think if you go back to your conclusion slide, I mean, I think you've gotten a lot of pushback on why there might be this apparent gap between the policy prediction and the larger theory. It's not a two-step game, it's an iterated game where you have to backwards induce the stability because the costs and benefits might be different and the information is incomplete, et cetera. But there's another reason I think there might be a big departure between any kind of social science theory and any kind of policy advice, which is that general averages are not point predictions. And I mean, I think others may have alluded to this, but let me just argue a little bit more about what Barry calls the facts of the case. I think it was Waltzing who said that asking liberalism or asking realism to explain the course of a falling leaf is asking realism to explain the course of an international conflict in one particular case is like asking the law of gravity to explain the course of a falling leaf. There's obviously lots of other factors that intervene, and our confidence in any point prediction is going to be small. And so when you're making a prediction about what to do in Ukraine at one particular time when dealing with one other particular country, there's no necessary reason your prediction has to follow dogmatically and mechanically from the thing that you believe explains most of the variation out there. And so, I study Mexico. I think that class conflict probably tells you a little bit about the broad sweep of Mexican history. But when I look at voting behavior data, I don't expect class to explain 90% of why one person votes for one party and not another, because it doesn't. And I think both of those things can be true. So that's another wedge, I guess, between your argument that these people are not following their beliefs when they offer predictions or commentary, and therefore their commentary is somehow illegitimate. I guess the other thing I would have is very quick, is just get BLUF up there, that acronym for bottom line front. Is that Do I need to cite you when I thought it was great. Bottom line up front, when I use that acronym to represent bottom line up front, because if so,
no,
I will cite you.
I thought I was like getting in good with you guys because I thought that's a military acronym.
Yeah. The military guys are like, we're on it. We have just a couple minutes, so quick answers.
Quick answer. So, yeah, the search for nuclear dominance is irrational. I mean, yeah, I think there's a strong case to be made that that's true. On the other hand, there's people like Darryl Press and Keir Lieber who say we had it. I don't know if they say we still have it, but they thought we had it, and that presumably they thought that was a good thing. If you read their commentary on foreign policy, they seem to argue it's a great thing, right? It'd be great if we had that first strike capability against China. So I think that's a debate out there. I mean, in truth, like I'm probably on the mad side, right? I think it's probably, for these technical, practical reasons, dumb to search for strategic superiority against like peer competitors, but against China, I don't know. In terms of the point predictions versus trends, well, there I think we do get into this like debate, Ken Wallace versus Colin Ellman, right? Should we expect realism to make predictions? And I think, yes, you absolutely have to expect it to make predictions. If it doesn't, it's junk, right? The law of gravity does explain what leaves do. Why are piles of leaves on the ground and not up in the sky? Because of the law of gravity, right? So to saying I can't predict the exact trajectory is correct, and if you want to predict the exact trajectory, you need a theory of air resistance and whatnot. That's true. But the law of gravity has got to predict the trend, and if you're not getting that prediction right, and you're invoking this whole auxiliary theory, which says why it's not happening right, then you're departing from your theory. So maybe it's a different perception of how much realism ought to predict or not, but yeah.
But you don't know. I mean, you personally have no way of judging how much of the trajectory of the fall of the leaf is gravity and how much is wind.
Well, in that case, you could figure it out.
The structural realism is meant for native ends, specific policies. You yourself have no particular insight into how much of the specific of non-structural realism is meant to predict as a general theory versus what the facts of the case are meant to do. Is that correct?
Kind of, although I think with quantitative work, you could actually make certain things about that if you actually factored in power variables versus, say, regime type variables or whatnot. But leaving that aside, like I guess all I would say is that if you're going to write a book like Steve Walt did, saying, here's my understanding of what drives American foreign policy, and it's all domestic politics, then you have departed from realism, right? You are no longer a realist. That's just not consistent with the theory, right? If the blob determines American foreign policy, you're not a realist. You are a domestic politics person.
I think the note that we're leaving on is no less provocative than the note we started on, but the time has been spent. I'm sorry, Jim, and I'm sorry to Austin and Josh or for others. Please join me in thanking the speaker.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.